For nearly 2 decades, one man lived inside an airport without ever boarding a plane. He was not hiding, not imprisoned, and not officially detained. He slept on a bench, washed in public restrooms, and existed in full view of the world, yet outside every system meant to recognize him. His problem was not poverty or crime. It was paperwork. Somewhere between borders, documents, and rules, his identity stopped existing. What followed was not a dramatic escape or a sudden tragedy, but a quiet disappearance in plain sight. Mehran Karimi Nasseri did not plan to live in an airport. His story began far from the polished floors and departure gates of Charles de Gaulle, shaped instead by displacement, identity, and uncertainty. Born in Iran, he spent much of his early life moving between cultures, studying abroad, and existing between countries rather than fully belonging to one. Political instability in Iran during the 1970s pushed many people into exile, and Nasseri was among them. He left his home country believing that legal documents and international systems would protect him. Instead, those same systems would later erase him. As borders hardened and paperwork became absolute, identity stopped being something personal and became something administrative. A passport, a visa, a stamp. Each one carried more weight than personal history or intent. Nasseri's life began to narrow, not through dramatic events, but through small bureaucratic decisions made far away from him. What followed was not immediate confinement, but a slow tightening of options. Each attempt to move forward relied on documents that no longer aligned. Each delay created another problem. At this stage, there was still movement, still hope, still the belief that the situation was temporary. Yet the conditions that would eventually trap him were already in place. His story is not about a single mistake or a single authority, but about how modern systems treat identity as something that can be misplaced, invalidated, or denied. Before the airport, before the bench, and before the years of waiting, there was simply a man trying to move through the world legally, trusting that the rules were designed to help him do exactly that. For Mehran Nasseri, the turning point did not arrive with an arrest or a dramatic refusal at a border. It arrived quietly, through the loss of a single object that modern systems treat as absolute, a passport. While traveling through Europe, Nasseri's documents were reported stolen, leaving him without the papers required to prove who he was or where he belonged. What followed exposed a harsh reality of international bureaucracy. Without documents, identity ceased to be personal and became procedural. Nasseri attempted to replace his papers, but every authority required proof that no longer existed. Each office directed him to another. Each form depended on information locked behind a previous decision. Countries that had once allowed him entry now required documentation he could not provide. Iran would not accept him without proof of citizenship. European nations would not grant entry without valid travel papers. Refugee status offered a possibility, but even that process relied on records and verification. Nasseri was not rejected because his case was unusual, but because it did not fit neatly into any existing category. Bureaucratic systems are designed to handle clear inputs and produce predictable outputs. Nasseri's situation broke that logic. He existed in the gap between jurisdictions, where responsibility dissolves. Officials were not necessarily hostile. Many followed procedures exactly as written. Yet that precision became its own form of denial. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they created a dead end. Nasseri was instructed to wait while authorities communicated with one another, but communication was slow, fragmented, and often inconclusive. Months passed, then years. During this time, Nasseri's legal status remained unresolved. He was neither approved nor fully rejected. This ambiguity proved devastating. Without a recognized identity, he could not work legally, travel freely, or establish a stable residence. Every attempt to move forward returned him to the same point of uncertainty. The system offered no resolution because it was not designed to address cases that fell between its categories. Nasseri's situation revealed how modern borders depend not only on geography, but on documentation. A person may physically exist in a place, yet legally remain absent. As time passed, the temporary nature of Nasseri's predicament began to fade. What was once a delay became a condition. Waiting became routine. Hope shifted from resolution to endurance. His case was reviewed, deferred, and archived, often without clear explanation. Decisions were postponed rather than denied, creating the illusion of progress while changing nothing. Nasseri was still moving, still complying, still following instructions. But the system no longer recognized him as someone who could arrive anywhere. Identity, once assumed to be inherent, had been reduced to paper. And without that paper, Nasseri's life was suspended, not by force, but by procedure. Nasseri's situation shifted from unresolved to suspended the moment he was physically unable to move forward or backward. Without valid documents, travel became impossible, but departure was not the only problem. He was now present in Europe without legal entry, yet there was nowhere he could be returned. Border authorities treated his case as temporary, assuming that another country would eventually take responsibility. Instead, responsibility circulated endlessly. Nasseri was allowed to remain in transit areas while officials attempted to clarify his status. This space, designed for short waits measured in hours, became his only legal ground. He could not cross a border because he lacked papers. He could not be deported because no country would accept him. He existed in a legal contradiction, present but not admitted, visible but not recognized. Airports are built to move people efficiently from one jurisdiction to another. For Nasseri, that movement stopped. The terminal became a holding space where time lost its normal structure. Days were no longer marked by departures, but by routine. Meals, rest, and observation replaced progress. Authorities continued to review his case, but always with the assumption that resolution was imminent. Each delay reinforced the idea that this situation was temporary, even as months passed. Nasseri complied with every request, answered questions, and waited. He did not resist or hide. Yet cooperation did not produce movement. Instead, it anchored him further in place. The longer he remained in transit, the harder resolution became. Systems designed for short-term exceptions struggled to address long-term reality. Nasseri was not confined by walls or guards, but by definitions. He was not detained, yet he could not leave. He was not free, yet he was not imprisoned. This ambiguity allowed the situation to persist without urgency. As weeks turned into years, the temporary space became permanent. The airport was no longer a pause between destinations. It had become the destination itself. Over time, the temporary arrangement solidified into something permanent. The airport terminal, designed for brief pauses, became a place of daily life. Sleeping occurred on benches meant for waiting. Washing happened in public restrooms. Meals followed the rhythm of vending machines and airport cafes rather than a household routine. What made the situation unusual was not discomfort alone, but duration. Days blended into weeks, and weeks into years. There was no clear moment when this space became a home, yet it gradually replaced every other option. Airport staff learned his presence as part of the environment rather than an exception. He was not hidden, escorted, or confined. He simply remained. Authorities continued to view the situation as unresolved rather than urgent. Because there was no crisis, there was no deadline. The absence of force created the illusion of choice, even though real alternatives no longer existed. Life inside the terminal followed rules that were informal but strict. Movement was limited by security zones. Privacy was minimal. Belongings had to remain portable. Yet within these constraints, routine emerged. Reading, writing, observing travelers, and maintaining order in a small personal space became acts of stability. This routine was not chosen for comfort, but for survival. The terminal offered visibility without belonging. Thousands of people passed through daily, each with a destination, while he remained anchored to the same spot. The contrast was constant and unavoidable. Departure boards updated endlessly, announcing journeys that did not apply to him. Time moved forward everywhere except where he stood. What began as waiting quietly transformed into endurance. The airport was no longer a place between destinations. It had become the boundary itself. As the years passed, the situation became normalized not because it was resolved, but because it endured. The terminal developed its own rhythm, and within it, a recognizable presence took shape. Airport employees began to treat him as part of the landscape, someone who belonged to the space without belonging anywhere else. Small accommodations appeared informally rather than through policy. Staff checked on him. Travelers noticed him. Journalists occasionally asked questions. Yet none of this altered the underlying reality. Visibility did not translate into agency. Attention did not create solutions. The system acknowledged his existence without accepting responsibility for it. Legal processes continued in the background, but progress was incremental and fragile. Decisions depended on distant offices, shifting regulations, and interpretations that changed over time. Even when sympathetic officials attempted to help, they were constrained by the same rules that had caused the problem. Offers of resolution often came with conditions that required documents he still could not provide. Each potential exit closed as quickly as it appeared. Over time, a paradox emerged. The longer he remained, the more exceptional the case became, and the harder it was to resolve. What began as an administrative oversight evolved into a unique legal anomaly. This uniqueness attracted attention, but it also discouraged action. No precedent fit. No authority wanted to set one. The terminal continued to function around him, efficiently processing thousands of passengers every day. Planes departed on schedule. Borders opened and closed with precision. Against this backdrop of constant movement, his stillness became more pronounced. The world was moving exactly as designed. It was only his path that remained blocked. Eventually, the story reached a point where resolution appeared possible. Legal advocates and officials outside the airport system began to intervene, attempting to untangle the case that had been deferred for so long. On paper, solutions existed. Offers were made that could have allowed departure, residency, or resettlement. Yet by this stage, the problem was no longer purely legal. Years of waiting had reshaped expectations, habits, and identity. The airport had become the only stable environment he had known for a long time. Leaving it meant confronting uncertainty once again, this time without the structure that had sustained him. Bureaucracy had frozen his movement, but time had altered his sense of direction. Decisions that once represented escape now carried risk. Even when opportunities arose, they required trust in systems that had failed repeatedly. This hesitation was not irrational. It reflected adaptation. The terminal had provided predictability in a life otherwise defined by administrative ambiguity. What began as confinement by paperwork had evolved into psychological anchoring. The distinction between choice and limitation blurred. Officials viewed the case as one that could finally be closed. From the outside, the solution appeared overdue. From the inside, leaving meant abandoning the only continuity left. The system that had erased his identity had also shaped it. Resolution, when it arrived, no longer meant a simple return to normal life. It meant another transition, with no guarantee that the outcome would be different. When the situation finally changed, it did not erase what had come before. Leaving the airport ended the physical confinement, but it did not undo the years shaped by waiting. Life beyond the terminal proved difficult to reintegrate. Ordinary decisions, where to live, how to move, how to belong, required adjustment after so long in a controlled, transitional space. Public attention increased as the story spread, transforming a private ordeal into a symbol. Media accounts often simplified the narrative, focusing on the strangeness of living in an airport rather than the systems that allowed it to happen. This framing turned endurance into curiosity and complexity into novelty. Yet beneath the headlines remained the same unresolved questions. How does a system designed for efficiency fail so completely when faced with ambiguity? How does legality override humanity without explicit cruelty? The case exposed a gap between intention and outcome, where no single decision appeared unjust, but the accumulation produced harm. For observers, the story became a cautionary example. For policymakers, it was an uncomfortable reminder of what happens when responsibility is endlessly deferred. For the individual at the center, it marked another transition rather than an ending. Freedom did not arrive as a clear break, but as a gradual, uncertain shift. The airport years could not be separated from what followed. They had become part of the identity that bureaucracy once refused to recognize. The story of a man who lived in an airport is often remembered for its strangeness, but its meaning lies elsewhere. It reveals how modern systems handle cases that do not fit predefined categories. Borders, documents, and procedures are designed to manage movement efficiently, not to resolve exceptions. When those exceptions persist, they are not corrected, they are absorbed. Responsibility becomes diluted, urgency fades, and waiting replaces decision. What makes this story unsettling is not the absence of rules, but their strict presence. Every authority involved followed procedure. No single action was overtly cruel, yet the outcome was a life placed on hold for years. The airport, a space meant to connect the world, became a place of isolation without walls. This was not a failure of empathy alone, but a failure of design. Systems built to process people can also erase them when flexibility disappears. The story ends not with a clear lesson, but with a question that extends beyond one individual. In a world governed by documents and borders, what happens to those who exist between them?